friends, welcome to Thursday's recording. Brief announcement before we get started. Remember to do your mid-semester student evals. It's a key lecture activity. It's due on Sunday. You have to submit the code word at the end of the survey to Canvas. I want you to be specific in this. You don't have to go into detail about every single thing, but if I ask you how lecture is going, it's going okay is pretty it's general. It doesn't tell me anything. I want you to tell me what you like. What specific thing do you like and why? What specific thing do you think can be improved? Why do you think it needs to be improved? Right? The more specific you are, the more actionable the items are. So once the student evals are done, I'm going to be going through and I'm going to be coding all the data, looking at the patterns that we see, and we will talk through those patterns. So please, more specific is better. Okay, today we are talking about privacy. So we're going to continue with this conversation around surveillance realism, what surveillance realism means, and how it relates to this thing called the privacy paradox. So from that Snowden video, right, that we watched near the end of lecture, you went ahead and watched that on your own. The researchers of that piece were interested in how people in the UK, the United Kingdom, would respond. How would they react and respond to the Snowden leaks? And what they found was that people weren't super fired up. People expressed ambivalence, confusion, a lack of knowledge of the case, and a lack of knowledge on how digital surveillance works and what could or should be done. And they found classic defenses of surveillance were highly prevalent. This idea we need surveillance for security. We need it to be safe. And this leads to the idea of surveillance realism, which is based on Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism from 2009. Capitalist realism is the idea that there is a perception of capitalism as the only viable political economic system, even though we realize it isn't fair. Because we perceive it as the only viable system, we are less likely to protest the system for the purpose of change. Surveillance realism, then, is the argument that the lack of transparency over what happens to our personal data in the digital age has led to this widespread sense of resignation. Not a consent that they should collect our data, but we're resigned to the fact that they do because we can't visualize a working alternative. Or if we can visualize a working alternative, we can't visualize the way that we get there. And in the article, they come to the conclusion that we understand this to entail a simultaneous unease among citizens with data collection, alongside the active normalization of surveillance that limits the possibilities of enacting modes of citizenship and of imagining alternatives. That's the last sentence of their abstract. What they're saying is that people grew up with surveillance and have come to accept it as the necessary way business is done. And that this is not to the advantage of the people, but the marketeers. And that all brings us to the privacy paradox. And this piece, The Privacy Paradox, How Market Privacy Facilitates Government Surveillance, by Karina Ryder. She is a professor in the Department of Sociology at University of Washington, if you are interested. And the idea here is that there's a paradox in terms of people's desire to have capitalist systems and be private individuals, and their acceptance of control from others. The article you read was based on debates in Congress from 1993 to 1999, which were around loosening the encryption controls. The arguments that were used were that we need to make sure people have access to various ways data is transmitted. We can't hide things. Everyone should get to look at their own stuff. And that access will keep criminals at bay. The idea further was that we don't trust the government to do this, but we think everyone should see their own stuff, then get in the market and sell what's useful to them. Because of these senses in public debate at that time, lawmakers who were considering regulation had proposed limits on what data could be collected, how it could be stored, and what you need to tell people about your collecting and how it will be transmitted to others. But what's happened is it's instead led to a period in which private firms work with law enforcement and governments to make sure surveillance works well. And as a result, people didn't and don't really know what's going on. The laws have emerged in a deregulated environment where we don't have a lot of access as individuals as to what's being collected about us. And these findings show an expansion of privacy for consumers and entrepreneurs has been used to achieve this contradiction of privacy from law enforcement and intelligence agencies. That is to say, that the argument that we shouldn't regulate this stuff has actually empowered law enforcement and intelligence agencies effectively. So the contradiction is that worries about fallacies and injustices of capitalism move to worries about widespread data collection. And an active justification of capitalism becomes active justification of surveillance practices. So the idea here is that over time, because we accept this surveillance, because we are realists about it, and have also been realists about accepting capitalism, we have this imagined shared reality that we're resigned to our fate. This is our cultural or political pragmatism. We do what we have to do in these spheres in which we're allowed. But what impact does it have on a society when we resign ourselves to no viable alternatives? When we say, this is the only option we have. What does that do to us? Well, one problem, with this at least, is what we can imagine as possible and what can change comes out of these systems. We, again, path dependence. We're building on the foundation of what came before. So we don't even consider not having our data collected or think we should stop using this app because it's using our data. I want you to think, this one that I love to see the show of hands on, how many of us actually read the terms and conditions or the consent of use forms that we click on all the time? I'm going to let you know that the most I've ever seen hands raised for this was one. One student who bothered to truly read through those terms and conditions. We just click a box. There's a whole South Park episode about this. That was also a parody of the Human Centipede. That we just accept that this is our fate. That there is no reason to read the terms and conditions because it's just going to be what it's going to be. This social imaginary that we all participate in limits what we can imagine in terms of change, and instead keeps us in a Foucaultian way, aka Foucault, normed into this culture, this disciplinary society, the society of control, where we don't even try to not be surveilled. We just expect that the newest app will surveil us more. And this leads to this internalized justification, and then we start to self-regulate, as Foucault and even Bentham predicted. And this leads to these arguments where, well, if you have nothing to hide, why worry about the fact that organizations are watching you and monetizing your actions? Why do we worry? I want to give you one example of why we worry. This is from an episode of like a 2000 serial show, something in the CSI, NCIS, whatever sphere. A man was on trial for terrorism, and this was based off of a true story, based off of not a one-to-one. But he was on trial, and he didn't know what. He didn't know what the evidence was. He didn't know why he was being put up for that. He is just suburban American man. Had a wife, had a kid, had no idea why the government had come and arrested him and was charging him with terrorism. Well, through the course of this episode, what they find out is that the family had a home computer that everyone used. And this man really liked gardening, so he had been looking up different fertilizers that he could use for his garden. And his son had been playing some violent video games or something, and his wife loved baking and had looked up a yellow cake recipe. And if you're not familiar, yellow cake happens to also be a nickname for a certain unstable substance that can be used in bombs. Fertilizer, also a very common bomb ingredient. So the government institution that had arrested him had been monitoring internet access, search history, use behavior. And they saw these three things. Their system flagged it. Because to the system, yellow cake, fertilizer, violent video games equals a terrorist threat. Nothing to hide, nothing to fear. So, in the article, we see quotes like, I guess it is just the age we live in, you know? It's just going to happen. Get used to it, I guess. We internalize this expectation of surveillance. We expect to be surveilled. So maybe we just need to behave rightly. Get used to it. I make sure I don't say certain things on Twitter that could possibly make me libelous or something. And on Facebook, I make sure everything's private, and I do as much private settings on Facebook as possible. Okay. So we have an expectation, an internalized expectation of surveillance. So we then self-regulate, using the technology or policing our own behavior and speech. This reinforces the norms that the surveillors want us to do. Based on the surveillance realism idea, we're self-regulating in ways that are beneficial to those surveilling us. And then this other theme emerges, that nothing to hide, nothing to fear mentality. We're not worried here about being surveilled by law enforcement, the government, or corporations, right? I think we are a pretty transparent organization. I don't think we have a huge amount to hide. We don't see that as being a particular concern. Nothing to hide, nothing to fear. So let's discuss. This is your lecture activity. Go to the privacy discussion. Make sure you're in privacy for that. And I want you to answer, is it true that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear? In your opinion, why or why not? And I want you to provide at least one example, your own example, either from the digital age or historical, that supports your position. So go ahead, pause the video, and then come back once you are done. Remember that you must have this lecture activity submitted during the regular class time. So it's got to be in by 12:50. All right, let's move on. So this idea of nothing to hide, nothing to fear, the attitude raises a couple questions. Certainly at least one of which is looked by your final reading from this week. So this article, Predictable Policing, New Technology, Old Bias, and Future Resistance in Big Data Surveillance, was written by two graduates of UW-Madison when they were PhD candidates here. The first is Xerxes Minisher, who last I had checked in was the Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in Technology and Justice and a visiting assistant professor in Peace, Justice, and Human Rights at Haverford College. Minisher is a graduate of the Journalism and Mass Communication Department at UW-Madison, and his research focuses on media technologies and relationships of power. And he wrote this piece with Liam Randall. You may notice a different first name on the published piece. As a rule, doesn't matter what people previously published the work under, you call them, you cite them by their current name. So Liam Randall is an assistant professor of communication at North Central Michigan College. Their research focuses on how race and disability are constructed through processes of criminalization. And they are a graduate of the Rhetoric, Politics, and Culture track of the Com Arts Department here at UW-Madison. And their underlying argument of this piece is that as much as we think this technology has changed everything, we need to be thoughtful about how the structures in our society are replicated and amplified, but certainly not escaped in these new technologies. In Predictable Policing, New Technology, Old Bias, and Future Resistance in Big Data Surveillance, we see an example where people might not be doing anything wrong, might not have anything to hide, but because of the community they are in, the way that they look, or their socioeconomic situation, maybe the structural biases that have existed a very long time in this country, also elsewhere, but we're looking at this country in particular, maybe those are going to have an impact in how they're surveilled and how that surveillance is turned into actions by institutional actors, such as law enforcement personnel. Now, part of this relates to this concept of critical race theory. And this concept has been demonized and just completely tortured, really, in popular media. So I want to make sure that our understanding of critical race theory, that we're all on the same page for it and its definition, that we're not basing it on the ways that it's been demonized in media. I want to make sure that we're on the same page before we continue. Critical race theory is an intellectual and social movement and loosely organized framework of legal analysis based on the premise that race is not a natural, biologically grounded feature of physically distinct subgroups of human beings, but a socially constructed, culturally invented category that is used to oppress and exploit people of color. And perhaps one of the easiest ways, at least for me, to think through this is the ways that certain groups that we would consider white now were historically not considered white. For instance, the Irish, right? I think that shows how whiteness was very much socially constructed in order to retain power among a few. So that's what critical race theories say, right? That the ways that we label people is not due to some kind of genetic or biological difference. It's due to the social construction. So the authors make this point when they talk about predictive policing, that the way in which the algorithmic system works, the way it functions to map onto different areas, the ways that it goes towards some communities where law enforcement are active more than others, what it's doing is mapping previous biases and histories onto the space of the neighborhoods, essentializing them, and as they say, the predictive maps work to bind beats to their histories, containing and essentializing the space, rendering the area stuck in time, unable to be seen as anything more than a seedbed of criminality or a safe zone. So what they're saying is that if you take all this data and make an algorithm to predict stuff based on this data, that it's then not operating in a neutral world. It's operating in a world in which people's beliefs, and now the argument fueling people's beliefs, is like path dependence. The algorithm amplifies, focuses, and essentializes. So when an officer looks at a specific street, the algorithm focuses on a specific street. It tells law enforcement to potentially increase patrols of that street. And when you increase patrols, you actually increase arrests. Not necessarily because people are doing bad things. As the authors mention, what we see is for problematic victimless crimes, the arrest rate goes up. Things like loitering, hanging out on a street corner. This then raises the instances of crime on that street, right? The data that says there's more crime happening there or in that neighborhood. And that hardens or essentializes that area as a place where crime happens. This imprints the history, which is already born of bias, right? The algorithm is not being neutral. Where police have had their beats in the past were not without bias. They didn't equally go to different areas. So this essentializes and perhaps amplifies the biases about a particular place. And this also works for places that had little crime in the past, but in the reverse. And the problem is that the arguments for this kind of policing, right, this number-based decision-making, asserts that the decision-making is more neutral this way. When you say, we can't be everywhere all the time, which is fair, you can't, right? So we need to put manpower towards some areas more than others. Then the data becomes biased and tells you what you already think. It reflects your own biases back at you. When you base your prediction on previous historical actions that are already biased, you're going to end up with more bias. And in fact, when decisions are made faster and more efficiently, it can actually amplify the bias and create this feedback loop. So in short, if you want to commit crime, go somewhere where people don't usually commit crime according to the data and the historical bias. This also relates to survivorship bias, the ways that data is biased. So some of you may have seen this before. This is a diagram that they made in one of the world wars that was where the planes had been shot. So it's a composite image based on the data of the planes that they had, where they had been shot. And they wanted to then say, this is where planes get shot, these are the areas we should reinforce. And a guy went, no, that's not true. We need to reinforce the areas where there are no bullets. And people were confused, didn't understand, asked him why. And he said, the planes that are getting shot in those spots aren't coming back. When your data is faulty, your result is faulty. Your conclusion is faulty. And if you start with biased assumptions and biased data, you're going to end with biased results. So here's a summary quote of the point that they're making here. Because these systems are predicated on past and present crime reports, biases that have informed policing practices in the past, like the surveillance of Black and brown communities and the criminalization of victimless crimes, loitering, prostitution, homelessness, are encoded into the predictive metrics. These programs are, of course, neither impersonal nor objective, though they clearly gain public credibility through being discursively framed as impartial and scientific. That's part of something that, as critical, thoughtful, digital savvy people today, we have to keep an eye on when people start trying to, say, sell us something as being neutral. We need to acknowledge that it's only as neutral as the data upon which it's built. And as we know, this is not neutral. And certainly in terms of crime and incarceration, we need to be aware of how these claims to neutrality reinscribe biases that disproportionately harm certain groups. And hopefully, through this article, at least in the case of Milwaukee, that's clear. But this ultimately connects to the main point of the class, right? We want you to think about the technologies that you use or that are used on you and question, where is the power? Who benefits? My goal here is not for you to fill a notebook with what I say and what I think and be able to parrot it back to me, but for you to learn and to start really thinking critically about the world in which we live, especially in terms of the digital technologies that we use. So, key takeaways. Widespread surveillance has led to an implicit acceptance of surveillance, that it is inevitable. This acceptance leads to self-regulation on the terms set by controllers of technologies, not just for us to do good things for society, but to do the things that the corporations want us to do. And know that these old structural elements are replicated and marketed, really, as seemingly neutral algorithmic systems. We think if we hand it over to the computer, we've removed bias and it's fully objective and fair. But the computers, the internet, our code is only as good as what we put into it. And humans are biased. And so, our systems are inherently biased as well. All right. Before we talk about next week, just want a reminder, Sarah and I are at a conference. There is an extra credit opportunity. If you get that turned into us by Tuesday's lecture, Platforms and Communities, then if you got it right, you will get extra credit. Tuesday, Platforms and Communities. Thursday, Digital Production. You've got 2 readings for Tuesday, 1 for Thursday. Remember, Design Lab is coming in to lab this next week, so you need to have your rough video, your raw footage there. You need to bring it with you and be ready to edit. You're going to want to have Premiere Pro downloaded. Unfortunately, Adobe Creative Cloud has discontinued support for Adobe Rush, which is basically a pared down version of Premiere Pro. Premiere Pro is really the industry standard. It's that and Final Cut Pro. So this doesn't hurt you. It's good to have this knowledge there. And Design Lab has experience with Premiere Pro. So that's not going to be a problem. But if you don't have the software downloaded and raw footage to work with, you're going to get behind. So make sure that you've got that for next week, and make sure that you do the quiz and turn in your mid-semester evaluation by this Sunday night. All right, we will be in person next week. I'm excited to see you all, see how you did with a fully virtual class. And yeah, I'll see you all on Tuesday. Bye.